Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Devin Gulbranson, and on behalf of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, I am delighted to welcome you today to today's second installment of our Hive Mind series, Artificial Intelligence, Machine Learning, and Transitional Justice: the Opportunities, Risks, and a Human Rights-Based Approach. Before I introduce our speakers and the topic, I would like to let the attendees know that we anticipate this session to be about an hour and a half. If you wish to submit a comment or question, you can do so at any time in the chat box or using the Q&A bar at the bottom of your screen. There will be time at the end for a designated Q&A session towards the end of the webinar, and during that time, you can also raise your hand if you wish to speak, and we will unmute you. If we do go over slightly, which does sometimes happen, please know that all of our virtual programming is recorded and made available on our website for future viewing and sharing. If at any time your connection is bad, you can try to turn off your video. And if you have any further technical problems during the meeting, please reach out to our tech support who is on the call, and we will do our best to assist you as quickly as possible. And finally, at the end of the session, you'll be directed to a survey, which we would be really grateful to have you complete, as it's so helpful for us to evaluate our future programming and future topics. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. By way of background, since 1999, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience has ignited a global movement to confront some of the world's most entrenched injustices. By harnessing the profound power of collective memory, CITES has forged a dynamic network of over 1,200 museums, historic sites, memory initiatives, and civil society organizations spanning over 80 countries. Together, we're not just confronting the past, but we're actively building a more inclusive, just, and peaceful future. In 2014, Sites of Conscience launched a consortium of international organizations focused on offering holistic, integrative, and multidisciplinary approaches to the issues of truth, justice, and reconciliation. The consortium, which is now composed of 15 organizations, works primarily with local populations, civil society, survivors, and governments to develop transitional justice approaches that are victim-centered, collaborative, and support dignity, respect, and inclusion in societies emerging from conflict or periods of authoritarian rule. Today's roundtable is being organized as part of a program within the Transitional Justice Consortium. For more information on how to join our network, please visit our website at sitesofconscience.org. Now, a little bit about the Hive Mind series and today's topic. At a time when our field is in flux due to funding pressures, global conflicts, and shrinking civic spaces, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience is convening this roundtable as part of a broader series to collectively shape conversations on the future of memory and justice work. And today's panel on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and transitional justice is no exception. It really seems that you can't go anywhere today, online or offline, without hearing about or encountering AI in some form or another. Today's conversation is born out of a policy paper that a few of our panelists here today have been working on, examining artificial intelligence and whether or not it has a place in transitional justice and human rights spaces. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are no longer emerging technologies. They are here and they are present in the tools that practitioners use to process testimonies, in the platforms that host documentation, in the algorithms that sort, flag, and prioritize information at a scale no human team could match alone. In transitional justice spaces, like in all of the other spaces we're seeing, there's a growing interest in what these technologies might offer. And the potential is there. AI can help analysts identify patterns across thousands of witness statements. Machine learning can assist in the verification of satellite imagery following mass atrocity events. Natural language processing models can support the processing of large archives that would otherwise take years to work through. But this potential is matched, if not exceeded, by the complexity and risk that AI can pose. Transitional justice and human rights are not neutral spaces. They're fundamentally about power. Who has it? Who doesn't? Who gets to tell their story? Whose account is believed? And who is ultimately held accountable? And when we introduce AI into that domain, we're not just talking about adding an efficiency tool. We're making a choice about how we handle evidence, about whose knowledge counts, and that has profound implications for justice, dignity, and for marginalized communities. And that's why this conversation today really matters because practitioners working in this field, many of whom are on this webinar with us today, deserve an honest conversation with what AI and machine learning can and cannot do, what values have to guide their use, and what must never be delegated to an algorithm. In other words, drawing the line where artificial intelligence ends and where actual intelligence, human intelligence, is non-negotiable. So stay tuned to the end to find out where we land on this. Guiding it, so I'm very happy to be joined today by our panelists who are all practitioners in this space who are actively grappling with the intersection of AI and transitional justice. Donna Ingleton is a human rights advocate and legal expert dedicated to advancing civil society protections and digital rights. As the executive director of Huradox, she leads global efforts to empower human rights organizations through innovative information and documentation tools. Previously, she was the deputy director at Amnesty Tech, where she played a key role in exposing unlawful surveillance through the Pegasus Project. With a law degree from the University of Ottawa, Donna brings legal rigor and strategic insight to her work at the intersection of technology and human rights, while championing inclusive leadership and digital resilience across sectors. Tin Geber is the director of Draft Lab, a creative project design studio dedicated to helping social good champions make responsible, effective use of data and emerging technologies. With a background in media studies and a master's in computational arts, Tin brings a mix of technical depth, creative expression, and on-message strategy to his work. His current focus is helping civil society and humanitarian organizations responsibly adopt AI and data infrastructure in high-stakes, politically sensitive contexts. And finally, we're joined by Peja Miletic, who is a data management and information systems practitioner with more than 20 years of experience supporting civil society, working in human rights, documentation, and transitional justice contexts. He's worked across the Balkans, Africa, and South America, helping organizations develop and maintain systems for secure data collection. His recent work includes support for organizations exploring AI-assisted analysis, model training, and responsible data governance. Thank you all for your time, and let's dive in. So my first question today is for Tin and Donna. And I don't think we can start a conversation about AI in transitional justice and human rights without first talking about ethics. Many in these spaces have valid concerns about whether AI should be used at all. And my question for the both of you is what ethical considerations, safeguards, or conditions do you believe have to be met before deploying these technologies in documentation, evidence analysis, or truth-seeking processes? Tin, let's start with you.
Thank you, Devin. And hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm very happy to be on this call and looking forward to your questions later. I know that both Dana and Teja have a much deeper understanding and experience and expertise within the transitional justice arena. So I will try to focus my input on the technological part and technology aspects, trying to kind of demystify as much as I can those bits and kind of provide some context into like what actually changes, like how is it different now with respect to other ways in which we integrate technologies in the past. And I think specifically on AI, and first and foremost, we can probably make like an immediate distinction between machine learning and generative AI, which is something we'll be talking about a lot later, because they are like kind of fundamentally different. The one thing that is common in both is that they are both designed around something we haven't had before when working with technology, which is a lack of transparency into the actual process of how decisions are made. We used to talk a lot about algorithmic transparency and the need to have auditability of tools so that we know exactly, what is the deterministic process that takes them from A to B, from input to output. The way machine learning works, and especially generative AI, is that we.
Sorry.
Yeah,
My fault.
all good?
All good.
Good. The way machine learning works and the way neural networks transformers work is that we literally cannot know how we go from input to output. What we know is that we can give it an input, tweak some parameters, and then see what comes out on the other side. We cannot know what exactly happened in the middle, right? So there's this black box that we cannot have any control over by, and we basically never will. Now we can talk about later about why that is, but fundamentally that is kind of the main component of the complexity and difference that using AI, especially generative AI, in any sort of process brings that wasn't there before. So if we think about kind of the standard precautions we would take when adding technologies to any system, from human rights based precautions like making sure there's free, prior, and informed consent, ensuring that there's a human in the loop, and so on. What is different now is that as soon as we start using AI or any kind of artificial intelligence technology, we already accept that there's this constant, not a variable, but a constant that we cannot have control over what happens in the middle of the process. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be using it. That means we just need to take that into account and then design processes that help us understand how best to organize the input part, how best to choose which technology we used for the processing, and how best to control what comes on the other side, right? So, the human in the loop component for, every consequential output is probably the most important part of the whole process, right? We can use artificial intelligence and very, very well to analyze and classify, amounts of data that are physically impossible to do otherwise. But we also always have to know that certain amounts of there's no amount of control or deterministic setup that will lead us to a process that we will always know what the output is. So basically, all of this to say, ultimately the output always has to be in human hands, no matter what happens in the middle. Again, I mean, fundamentally, the question is if we think about the classic kind of the standard precautions we would take, then the question always becomes, how can we think about them now that we are using AI? So for example, if we know that chain of custody and audit logs are kind of foundational to anything we are doing in terms of collecting and documenting data, how does using a black box in our process influence our chain of evidence in our audit log? And does that involve or require parallel systems or the use of AI as a verifier that then gets implemented through then the real process gets implemented through traditional means? Other components, of course, then we go into the space of what how AI has been trained and what it has been trained on, which is statistically most available data that always by design and default will prefer and mostly highlight the statistically most present people using the internet very specifically, which then automatically means that we will have problems with both language and with cultural validation. We will have big problems with the biases in the system, and we'll talk a lot more about this later, and so on. And then I think the last part, and then we'll leave the floor over to Dana, is the aspect of fundamentally, how do we defend transparency of the process when we start using generative AI? How do we create a system that has transparency and accountability both to the affected community that we're working with and the ultimate kind of beneficiaries of whatever we are building, be it international courts or any kind of legal system? Those questions are, again, the hard ones in this aspect because of the lack of the deterministic output that we just cannot have. So we have to design kind of parallel systems or different ways of engaging with AI that still allow us to not lose focus of the fundamentals of how we would implement technology in these processes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tin. Yeah, the transparency question I think is one that we'll spend a bit more time on later on as well. Donna, I want to go over to you. I know that at Huradox, you guys have been starting to really think about this and implement this in your work. Can you talk to us a bit about the ethical considerations that you've been making and what has that been like with your work?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. And first of all, I just want to start by saying thank you to all of the organizers. Devin, thank you for that really great introduction. I really loved that you made the distinction around balancing artificial intelligence and like real intelligence. And I think that's another really sort of helpful way of thinking of human in the loop. Like artificial intelligence can only go so far, and we need to use it as a tool. And I also really have to say, I liked that you started with just being straight up that this stuff is here and that it could be useful in transitional and human rights work. Because I'm going to start with some ethical principles that maybe we don't hear so often in these discussions. And I'm actually going to start with like bravery and imagination. Because one of the things, in the paper that I believe will be circulated after, but one of the findings in the paper was about whether, making a decision about whether to use commercial AI systems or develop in-house solutions, right? And the reason I mention this under bravery and imagination is that I find, in our community, in the civil society community, there are many NGOs and researchers who are rightfully raising the risks and harms related to AI and other frontier technologies. But the unintended consequence of that, or maybe, yeah, I'm going to say it's the unintended consequence, is that a lot of NGOs who aren't very technical and don't have that deep understanding then get scared off of using these tools in their work. And to me, it compounds an already existing digital divide in our community. And that's going to put us on a back foot. That's not to scaremonger anyone into using these tools, but it is to say that as we're going forward, there are, the way that big tech is running things right now doesn't have to be the way that tech is run, right? Like we have gotten into a place where like the internet itself is run by a couple giant tech companies who are more powerful than states. But there are other ways that we can organize. We can push towards sovereign infrastructures or semi-sovereign infrastructures on which to run our own tools. So I think so just being, bravery and imagination, thinking, can we do things a little bit differently? We don't need to fit AI into the systems that we have now. We can build a system that would allow us to use ML and AI tools in a more ethical way. So for me, it's also about taking that step back. And I also, there's another distinction that I would like to make following from that. One is that there's a difference between then if you're using commercial AI tools or you're developing your own, right? And if you're using the big tech tools, we know that once you've entered that data, Tin was talking to this. Like once you've entered that data, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. You also know that that data is no longer yours. It is going into servers, probably in the US, which probably means that, and under the US Cloud Act, your data becomes very vulnerable. So when we're talking about transitional justice and human rights processes, which are, which contain deeply sensitive information, we have to be really, really careful about what is going into those. So all organizations should have a policy on how commercial AI fits into their work plans. And to make sure that that sensitive data is not going into those, whilst also trying to develop tools that do work. The other one that I would say, and again, this is maybe one that doesn't get touched on all the time in an ethics conversation. I mean, I think data protection and human in the loop are sort of the ones that we talk about a lot, which include consent and everything. But the other one I want to mention is that there is an ethical consideration around choice of tools, meaning you don't always have to use the biggest, shiniest tool to get the job done, right? So if we know that, large language models or agents, whatever, are going to take our data, we don't have the semi-sovereign infrastructure yet to run it themselves, but everyone wants to use it. Like, do you need that? There's probably some machine learning tools that would do the same amount of work that you could host locally. So I think there's also a piece around being critical going into what you are using, and everyone having a responsibility to develop their critical tech literacy around these in order to make informed ethical decisions. And I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Donna. That was great. And now you guys have both brought up some of the risks and some of the potential. So I'd like to bring in Peja. Peja, you're one of the co-authors of the policy paper alongside Tin. And based on the paper's findings, can you walk us through some of the most significant risks and opportunities that you found for AI and machine learning in these spaces, and how practitioners can navigate these risks?
Yeah, Devon, thanks for the question, and thanks everybody for joining, and also thanks to Tin and to Dana for being with us on this webinar. Yes, so when we started to draft the policy paper, we were thinking about, how to write about the topic that is being also so hyped, and that, many people talk about it, and not everybody is sure about, what AI means at all. So yeah, for the purpose of this policy paper, we wanted to make something simple and accessible, to be available for the broader public. And so maybe some of the terms have been intentionally simplified. So yes, when we're talking about AI, we also included some data-driven technologies that, that originate way back, maybe, 10 or 10 plus years ago. So because in this latest developments, actually there's a situation that organizations and other TJ actors are actually combining different AI technologies. So this is why we just under one umbrella, we're just putting like AI, but we all know that there are so many different tools, different models, different, as Tim mentioned and Dana mentioned. So for the policy, and of course, there is so many great resources that we came upon while drafting that policy paper soon to be distributed. So some of the main opportunities and risks, as we underline them with the use of AI, are actually that use of AI reduce the time and effort, as it's being mentioned. So it helps us to analyze large amounts of information in a much shorter time than it used to be until recent. Then those tools also support classification, tagging, and pattern recognition, again, of the large volumes of the documentation. In some situations, they can help with the early identification, in systems, so they can provide for improved prevention, early warning, and strategic responses. And they can also enable the support between the organization, meaning, the different organization and different, not just organization, but also other stakeholders, including transitional justice, can work on adopting similar methodologies and finding the ways of better cooperation, joining different and establishing different networks for exchange information. And of course, use of AI can narrow this capacity gap that exists, that both of the that's already been mentioned. So there is a huge gap. So some of the organizations working in this field are still stuck in some big backlogs of information that still needs to be digitalized. Not speaking about coming to the use of AI. So still this can really help to bridge that gap, to narrow this capacity gap. And speaking about risks, of course, we are all aware of the existing and persisting risks there in which the organizations are working. Speaking about lack of funds, access to the internet, sometimes electricity shortage, and many other problems that they are facing, security threats and issues. And besides that, some really AI-related risks could also be the concerns related to privacy, as already mentioned, meaning that, again, private companies can gain a large concentration of power, having the information in their hands. Then ethical challenges that are being mentioned related to collections, processing, and use of information. And then, of course, confidentiality, jurisdiction, transparency, and informed consent. That also needs to be integrated now in the root of the process of collecting information. Some other risks could refer to unregulated legal frames, which means, for example, we are not still, fully clear about, what's the legality of large-scale data scraping or the absence of frameworks for disclosure, permission, or design of information. And just a few others. So there's a model strain on incomplete or biased data sets, especially when coming to some very important decisions that can, change have significant consequences. Also, as we all know, AI tends to hallucinate. So if it's not fed well, sometimes, in the responses, it tends to fill in the responses with whatever, finds so it also needs to be, if it's, again, this is again related to the bias, but then finally it's also good to mention that besides using AI for the goals of transitional justice actors, the AI it's also being used by adversarial parties in order, not just mentioning military industry, but also mentioning your surveillance, also mentioning intimidation, threats, also protection of the personal information and other things. So there is also other way around of use the AI that also could be also mentioned as a risk. So yeah, I will stop here for now, and maybe we can go with another round of questions.
Thank you, Peja. Yeah, I think a lot of those risks are very valid, and I think is the main source of concern for a lot of NGOs trying to figure out where AI fits in their work. Now that we've kind of gone through that, my next question is to Tin. In your work, you have done a lot about how to integrate ethically these kinds of technologies into your work. And what does a human rights-based approach to AI in human rights and transitional justice look like in practice? And how can the principles that govern this work, like informed consent, dignity, accountability, do no harm, and local ownership, be operationalized when we're designing and implementing AI tools?
It's a very good question. I took notes of every one of those so I can kind of try to respond to each. For context, for the people on the call, with Draft Lab, we developed a couple of working AI-enabled or AI-assisted projects in the humanitarian sector and in the human rights impact assessment sector. Projects that are intended to, facilitate or support the creation of response plans at the beginning of a humanitarian disaster. In the moments in which people on the ground have to write a response plan within 48 hours, but also have to, open the shelters and get the trucks to the place where they need to go. And other projects that help people analyze their own technology and their own human rights risks with using technology in their projects. And I would say I think it's, I think what changes is that first and foremost, one big change is the internal capacity change for the organizations. There's no way around needing to know more than we know as a baseline about how AI works, what it does, and how to kind of measure it, talk about it, and explain it to others. Why? Because fundamentally, like, let's say if we start from consent, right? Free, prior, and informed consent, when we are using AI, becomes a more layered approach, right? Because we would also be collecting consent at the, for example, the at AI processing moments, where we would need to be able to explain to beneficiaries or data providers what exactly will be the ways that data will be processed, what kinds of models will be used, what kinds of biases those models tend to have, what we know we can expect, what we know we can't expect from them, what are the margins of error, and so on. And being able to explain that in human terms to people requires us knowing very, very well, the usual apologies for the long letter, I didn't have time to write a short one, applies here. So I think that is kind of the first step, is the ability and the internal capacity, either internal capacity or the ability to trust trusted partners to develop and deliver those tools for groups. Like, a group like HuriDocs bakes into their systems the machine learning components that are also explained through the documentation of the projects themselves, for example. Another part is some of these, some areas are very, very hard to even think through. Like, for example, if you think about accountability, right? Who is responsible if a model gets things wrong? If it hallucinates a name of a perpetrator that doesn't exist, right? A source that was never developed. If that gets through all the way down to a court, like, who will be held responsible? If we're working with commercial entities like Anthropic or OpenAI, we know very well that their terms of service protect them very well from any kind of liability in those cases. So then we get to the point of, okay, does this mean we run our own internal systems? Again, what kind of resources do we have to do that? Who are the partners we can work on this with? Then, of course, when we get to for example, if you think about local ownership, which is what I think is great that we have Curidocs here, and especially around the data ownership around these systems, there's the local ownership of my organization owning my entire process, in the sense of having it on a physical server that I can control and maintain. But there's also the local ownership in the sense of, how do I get meaningful input from the communities I'm collecting data from about my entire process, right? What kinds of information do I need to bake into the process in order to do that? And again, even if I'm using my own local systems, I will be using training models that have been developed by somebody else. 99 times out of 100, I won't be creating my own training data. That's the most difficult part of the entire process. We have some open source models. They have all been trained within, or most of them have been trained within, the classic corporate capitalist systems, right? So we maybe have the training model that we can use, but we cannot know what training data it's been trained on. So, there's a lot of, even if we have our own local system, there's a lot of kind of lack of transparency we can have in those systems. That being said, I mean, I'm hoping that I'm not sounding too negative on this, because I do believe that the use of ML and AI is a game changer for many approaches, especially when it comes to analysis and classification of enormous amounts of data, that we all generally work with. We have an example in the report, and I'm going to cut it now because I know I'm almost going over, of Mnemonic, which is an organization that collects all the video footage it can find online about unrests and civil disobedience or attacks on the population by the government in different areas. They collect it, they store it before it gets deleted from the online networks. That is an enormous amount of data to go through, to parse, to understand, to classify, right? So we kind of, it's a little bit like, we need to understand that that's the best choice, but we need to have structures to make it work for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Tin. And now I want to shift the conversation a little bit, because one thing that I don't want to lose in this is, where do victims and survivors and marginalized communities fit within this discussion on the development and governance of AI-enabled initiatives? So my question is, how can we as practitioners ensure that these communities are not just sources of data, but active decision makers in how these technologies are used, interpreted, and governed? Donna, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. Thank you for the important question and for keeping people at the center of this conversation. I mean, I think I just want to highlight again for everyone listening, like this notion of data justice in the digital rights space is really big. And it's really comes from, the data justice and thinking about the ownership of data isn't just about AI. This has been something that's been happening in our communities for a really long time. Happening as in sometimes people are treated as, there's extractivist research, like, oh, this is the information about this. I'm going to go use it for this. And also, there's been a long history of fighting against it. And I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is that data is not apolitical, particularly not data that has to do with transitional justice and human rights. Data is politics when you're looking at histories of violence, when you're looking at identity, when you're looking at memory, which is such an important thing to keep in mind, because then it gives it gives data something beyond the pieces of information that are flying around the internet. It's data, it's ownership, it's political. And so one of the things that we have done, or we recently had a study performed by an OTF fellow, and the Open Technology Fund. I'm not sure if people follow, but they have fellows who work with different organizations. And we had an OTF fellow specifically looking at the experiences of human rights defenders in the development of and use of digital security tools in Kenya, Zimbabwe, Senegal, and the DRC. And I just kind of want to go over some of those findings because though they weren't specifically around the development of AI tools, the findings are still incredibly relevant. So one of them was to prioritize user-centered design. This is not new, this is not groundbreaking, but I think that we often forget that user-centered design for tools that we can develop can still be used when you're developing either workflows with AI or developing your own machine learning tools. So it really is thinking about who are the people whose data we are going to be using and how should we involve them to ensure we're honoring the politics of their situation, right? And so it just changes your approach a little bit. There's also localized tools for contextual relevance. This becomes really important when we're looking at like translating interfaces, documentation, and adapting tools to cultural and political context to improve usability and trust. Tin spoke a lot about informed consent. And that's a really interesting piece when it comes to this because, how are you localizing an understanding of the integration of ML tools is important. Also establishing continuous feedback loops and engaging in co-design with human rights defenders while you can. I'm going to keep it really short because I know everyone's going to be answering this question. So I will keep it there. I will just end with saying, that we need to constantly remember that the expertise in that situation doesn't reside with us or the tools. It resides with the people whose data it is. And always having that as our North Star is the key.
Yeah, you bring up a really important point that their data is political. It's also very personal, and it's hard enough to get victims to talk to us as is. And when we're introducing this kind of unknown variable, it can get very, very tricky. Peja, I want to go over to you on this question.
Yeah, thanks, Devin. I can share some actually from my previous experiences. As we know, the let's say like a witness statement or testimony is at the core. It's the heart of the process, and I don't see why it wouldn't stay like this even when this change circumstances of use the AI. So the thing that we need to be sure about that all the possible consequences of the acts that if we are, working on behalf of the victims from the victim perspective, what we need to be sure is that they're aware of all the consequences. They're accepting the risks. So we are working together to improve the visibility, to enhance the capacities in order, to come at this accountability or whatever other transitional justice purpose. So without that, testimony statement, we don't have anything. So that this is why we really need to stick to it and use all of those tools just in order to, as I said, increase visibility or promote so that public is aware of what happened in the situation. So yeah, maybe sometimes there would be a problem for victims and their families to understand the entire. So this is why we need to be capable of explaining that in a simple word. So this is also a practice for us, because if we cannot explain it in a way that they can understand, that's also a challenge. How we're going to explain it to the public again. So yes, we take this technology part, but again, we need to be able to explaining both to the publics and both to the communities why this is important, why we are using this in a best possible interest for all the actors involved, and I think it's just the key is to keep it simple. Thanks.
Thanks, Peja. And then Tin, I'd love to hear your perspective on how to keep victims, survivors, and affected communities kind of at the center of your decision making with AI.
Yeah, I think a couple of very good points, and I love going third in these situations because I can just riff off of the bigger brains of my colleagues. I think a big part of it is like one point that you made, Devin, that I really vibe strongly with me. It's like it's hard enough to get victims to talk to us. The process of sitting down, human to human, that's something we've been discussing a lot about, like user interfaces and kind of forms that are designed to people who use tablets and so on. Like how do we are basically replacing human interaction with a screen. How do we make trust work in a screen, right? And people who have been collecting testimonies know how hard is it to get to people, for people to sit down with you and share their information with them. In a way, if we know beforehand that we will aim to use AI to make it better and simpler for them to open up and talk, for example, by saying our process here is to just press record and have a long and open conversation, and then we will use our own AI, our own systems that we control fully to extract data from that, and then we will share it back with you. There is a component to which we can say, okay, how can we make it so that our use of AI actually becomes a way for the people we are working with to be more comfortable, build more trust, right? And it can very quickly go flip on its head, right? Because very quickly, if I introduce a technology that isn't clear or it doesn't bring the same level of trust that I bring, I can, fundamentally shut that door down. So then for me, the question is, okay, if we know we will be using AI in the background to do analysis and so on, how can this be presented in the best way possible, very clearly, very transparently, in a way that makes trust stronger and not lose trust? One component. And the other part that I wanted to mention is, I talk a lot about free, prior informed consent, because those never go away. That's kind of at the basis of everything. I also think that then I mentioned localized tools, and I think that's a big part of when we think about when we are collecting, for example, testimonies. It will always almost exclusively be from marginalized communities or minorities that are never as represented in the data sets as as other groups. So we already know that no matter whatever we are collecting will be analyzed through a biased system. And that is something we need to keep in mind and also explicitly explain from the beginning.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important, like when we're talking about data, I think a lot of us have become so desensitized to signing away our data, agreeing to the terms and conditions. But when we're talking, excuse me, about, data here, I mean, we are talking about survivor testimonies. We're talking about some of, the most traumatic event of someone's life, and how we handle that with absolute care is really important, even in these kind of seemingly distant systems. We're going to get to our final question for the panelists, and I want to say to the room, if you do have questions, you can start to put them in the chat so that we can hit the ground running for the Q&A session. But my final question to all of you is, looking ahead, where do you see AI and machine learning adding the greatest value to transitional justice processes, and where should actual intelligence, human intelligence, and survivor testimony remain non-negotiable and not up to an algorithm. So Donna, we'll start with you. What are your non-negotiables?
Great. I mean, so I think for me, for us at Heradox, I think for all of us using these tools, we need to remember what the greatest value add is, right? And what is the value add? What is the purpose of these tools? It's really areas involving large scale administration or analytical tasks that would otherwise overwhelm human capacity, right? And so we're looking at transcriptions, translations, archive organization, evidence preservation, searchability, satellite imagery, identifying patterns, like it goes on. But just thinking about those large processing things where it would normally take, research teams or research assistants months and months and months to find the pattern. Now, but that's as far as it goes, right? So we need to use those, but always have the people with the creativity, with the knowledge. I mean, this goes to a bigger issue, I think, which is in human rights, transitional justice, humanitarian work, right? It's not a test. There's no like, this is correctly how it's done. It's always about getting information in, understanding the international framework, and saying, this is what we should do in this situation, right? And that is impossible for machines to do, I will say, or to do it accurately, because there's that lack of creativity that humans in this space have. So for me, it's about making sure that we're using it for the right purposes to augment our ability to fight for what we believe is right in the world, for justice, for human rights, and just using the tools as a bit of an assistant. And yeah, I guess I would just say processing information and that pattern recognition, the reason you have to have the people who have also that understanding of the human rights framework or a humanitarian framework is because going back to my point earlier, that the data is very political, and this is fundamentally about recognition of dignity and accountability. So I would say that. Two other quick things I would mention. One is that one of my fears, so another thing that's a non-negotiable, is that we become over-reliant on these tools. And when we become over-reliant on tech tools that aren't built on the struggles that we are fighting for, we lose our ability to keep the politics at the center. I mean, I keep going on about this politics thing, but I think it's really important. So also, making sure that we're not becoming, we have moments where the human is in the loop constantly. And I guess the last quick thing I would say, so we have time for the other panelists on this one, is one of the findings of the report is about how it's sort of undeniable at this point that the adoption of AI and frontier technologies is outpacing the regulatory capacities of governments, of regional mechanisms, of international mechanisms. And so there is a large body of academic thinking right now and practice around, well, if there aren't going to be regulations, how can we set norms of practice in how we're working and how we're developing these tools and how we're using them that might then influence regulatory systems when they finally catch up? And I think for me, it's a non-negotiable for civil society using and making these tools to always have that in mind. Our practice will set norms that could influence regulation at some point, and we need to be very aware of that. And I will end there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Donna. Paige, over to you. What are your non-negotiables for where AI starts and stops?
Yes, how I see it in the next few years. So maybe I can remember maybe 10 or maybe a little bit more years ago, I was in contact with some staff from the Heradox. I remember then they were developing some like a machine learning models to try to expand it, not only in English, but also to other local languages. I remember, so that was a very long time ago now. What we have nowadays is that in the main world languages, we can, convert text to speech and other way. And but still, again, there is so much space to conquer, if I can say it like this. So there is a lot of space to move forward, to use AI to empower those that are not, in this like mainstreams. Currently, I've been cooperating with the organization that has to transcribe so many oral history interviews, and they're estimated that they will need around 5 years to do it from the local language. So if the AI could be trained to do that work, at least, to do the initial transcription, and then, with the human oversight later, then that could increase, this decrease this period up to maybe 50%. So I think also what Dana said, I agree. I don't see why organizations don't cooperate much more than they cooperate. So the landscape is kind of atomized. I think that there is so much tools, so much good initiatives, but okay, and some of them are working globally, but most of them again been based in the north, right? Not in the south. So there is a space that organizations from the global south can become the owners of their information. Also to have the technology, to have the knowledge, to have the equipment, to work to own their data and to work with their data, of course, with the help of everybody else. So yeah, what we are seeing also recently is that even the very, blatant, I mean, very, very open scenes of human rights violation broadcasted online don't bring to accountability, and this is again, situation isn't so very well for those kind of efforts, even with the AI or without the AI. So we really need to take the ownership of the process by being part of it in a way that we push for the regulation, that we push for the cooperation, and to push that donors are really support this building the internal AI systems inside the organizations, inside the groups of organizations that would make them less dependable on commercial hosting softwares, and so to keep their information safe, to keep it private, and to protect the interest of the victims and their families in their search for the justice. So yeah, I will end here, and happy to answer more questions if there are.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Peter. And finally, Tin, your thoughts on your non-negotiables on where AI starts and stops.
In like technical development in programming, my favorite description definition of AI is that it is an excellent junior developer if you are a senior developer. And it applies to most contexts. It is an excellent junior research assistant if you are a senior research manager. AI can deliver very quickly and very effectively and very, very well to the levels that we sometimes physically wouldn't even have the physical time to do. But its output quality will be as good as is the structure, the definition, the framework that it's given within which it works. And that framework, that project design, that process definition comes from the human expert that designs it for them. So that's like the first approach. Like that's where, let's say the non-negotiable more, I would say more like that's where the surface connection is. That's where like it passes from human to AI. Excellent structure, perfect vision of what, it's a little bit like I need to already know what I want to achieve. I just don't have the 3 years to do it. And then I can have AI do the 3 years of work for me. But I already kind of have to know exactly what I want the outputs to be. That's one side of the surface. And the other side of the surface, why it still needs very expert eyes, is that AI is excellent at producing almost perfect content. And all the content will be very plausibly right, which means that the mistakes, then there will always be mistakes, will be very hard to catch for an untrained eye. So that is where the other component, that again, this is the human expertise and the human ability to analyze and investigate this and take the final step, becomes more and more important, because as these systems become better, they will never become correct. It's impossible. The whole point of generative AI is they hallucinate, but we force them to hallucinate in a way that we like. So there will always have to be a step of a human expert who comes in and checks it and says, oh, this sounds very, very good, but it's absolutely not right and it cannot work.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really important question. So again, if you all have questions, please put them in the chat. But just as a follow-up to that, I think you all have kind of hit on this point of making sure that we're utilizing AI as a tool and not a crutch. And I think this human in the loop function is a really interesting conversation because one of the fears of AI, and this is beyond just the human rights space, is what is it going to do to people's jobs? And what you're talking about, Tin, is, it's not that we won't need data analysts anymore. We still will, but their job function will change if AI is integrated. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've been seeing it a lot, especially kind of in the technology world. There is an issue with, I will do this parallel because I think it applies here as well. There's a problem for junior developers right now because they cannot find easily work because most of what you would train a junior developer on is things that AI is really good at. So I've been in spaces where organizations would like stop hiring junior developers because, AI can do it, but then find out fairly quickly that without a pipeline, like a ramping up space for junior developers to become senior developers, at some point you lose the senior developers, right? It's a very short-sighted way of looking at it. So I think the way this would change is like we would need to start looking at junior assistants and data analysts from the perspective not of how can I replace them, because AI can do it better, but how can I help them get to the point where they can utilize AI and then strengthen our entire process together? So it's kind of like, we need to understand a lot of technologies bring, the classic, what was it, the horse whip for the buggies analogy that kind of always applies with the steam machines. But I think in this space, there is the need is to kind of shift the focus of what actually what it means to be an analyst, what it means to be a researcher, with the addition of generative AI and AI in general.
Absolutely. And Donna and Paige, did you want to jump in on this conversation?
Well, yes, nothing special. I think that so yeah, we can divide actors into those that, the collecting information, helping from this development aspect, and finally those that, help this all together go. So yeah, examples of Syria, examples of Ukraine are showing us that there are that's great results could be achieved when tech persons are joined with practitioners, join hands with others. So yeah, the results speak from themselves. Don't have anything to add on this topic.
The only thing I would jump in on is I think I'm really glad, Tin, that you mentioned this issue of if we use AI for junior developers and junior researchers, then eventually we won't have any senior researchers. Like and then work ourselves into a space where we don't have the experts and the passionate people around these areas. I don't necessarily have a solution because we all are in this like financial issue where we're trying to be as effective as possible and we're all trying to meet our objectives, and like these tools are really alluring. But thinking about for us at Herodox, I would just say we've been really consciously trying to better engage with youth and young activists, trying to bring in youth and the voice of young people into our work, including our work with ML, so as to be making sure that we are supporting more generations of people coming up loving the work and fighting for justice and human rights. And I think just being very aware of that is something that we all need to do.
Yeah. And we have a great question from the chat in the spirit of transparency about disclosing when you're using AI for a specific project, and when and how do you disclose when and how you're using it. So to help, again, to help show there's some transparency, but also to teach other organizations about the available technologies and their applications. Do any one of you feel strongly about this to jump in? Donna, how are you guys?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in really quickly. So we actually have a new internal AI policy for when we're using AI tools, like not for when we're integrating the ML tools that we've built into our flagship tool, which is called Uwazi. For anyone who is interested, it's a documentation software tool that we have built a number of ML tools in to help you process data. I'll drop the link to it in the chat in a minute. But for when we're using proprietary AI tools, we do now have a policy of disclosure. So we will say it's a blog post that we have put up. We'll say, this was written with the editorial support of AI, or if we use it in other processes, we will disclose. We've also disclosed when we won't use it, right? So we've made a commitment. This is not necessarily about the processing the data of human rights work, but we won't use it in our like HR, for example. So we let people know when we're doing recruitment, we're not using AI to process your data. So there's disclosing it when you use it, and there's disclosing it when you clearly don't. And I do think that doing that publicly is really important for people to start to see that it is kind of being used, where it's okay, and where we should be drawing those lines. That was part of the question from earlier.
Thank you. Tin, you're
Feel
in.
very strongly. Can I jump in?
Yeah, very. Go ahead.
100% agree with Dana, and this is a wonderful question, and it's a question that I know there's a couple of groups that are trying to design kind of symbology, right, for the kind of disclosure of AI usage. It's a bit of a dream of mine is to be able to slap a symbol on my website that shows clearly like some AI has been used, or this has been completely vibe coded, and to be very transparent about this. I think it's relevant. I think it's important. I think we are in the space where people tend to not want to show that they used AI on a thing, which brings the entire the whole shadow administration, shadow software problem to the front. And I think it's very good to be proactive, to be very responsible about it. I remember a couple of years ago, I was at Philea meeting, a meeting of donors, European donors, and there was discussion about whether they should or should not accept AI-based proposals from organizations. And some organizations said, we absolutely do not want it. We don't want anybody writing anything with AI. Others said, we are okay with getting stuff with AI because we are going to parse it with AI anyway. At which point I was like, I think that's the worst of all options, because at that point we just have bots talking to other bots. One organization had a very good approach to this, which was they accept the use of AI in writing proposals, but that use of AI has to be disclosed and explained. This is why we used AI here, and this is what it enabled us to do in this report, for example. So yeah, all for it, Eric. It's an excellent question, and as soon as there's a commonly agreed certification or system out there, I will be the first one to put it on every single project I do.
Absolutely. I think we all would. Paige, did you want to jump in on disclosures?
Yeah, sometimes I have a feeling that it's like kind of shaming, if somebody's using AI for, but as Tim mentioned, for those kind of proposals, reports, and some kind of simpler things, I don't see the point why hiding that, some that you say some of your time, for some of the simplest things. I don't think it's a bad thing to do. So, for example, Google Maps was created with the input of millions of routes, and as the same thing is being created with the millions of data being analyzed, processed. So it's just offering some, shorter way that you can, just save some time. So for simpler tasks, of course, yes, I don't see what's the purpose of hiding. But with some other stuff, there are more serious intellectual property things and some other, ideas, designs. Of course, it needs to be clear, as Tim said, what amount it's being AI is being used, and what part is the human intelligence.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to part of the conversation we were having on developing your own internal policies and checks and balances, and what is, your organization's threshold for what level of AI are you accepting, right? Is it okay to use AI to do grammar and spell check if you're writing a proposal not in your native language? Is it, if it's 100% AI? Do you have a panel of, just humans where you are, reviewing these proposals? So it's a lot again about, I think Donna made this point of, making sure that your practice of how you're integrating AI can help inform how others adopt and utilize AI. As we're waiting for other questions, I think one thing that I wanted to parse out a bit more is that I think each of you had referred to developing your own internal AI capacities, and I want us to make sure that we all understand what that means. Is it, an enterprise model of ChatGPT, Claude? Is it a totally different AI system outside of the commercial? I don't know if any of you want to maybe define this a bit more so we understand what internal AI means.
I would recommend Dana to go first because I think HereDocs has been doing the most work with their own internal MLs.
Okay.
Thanks, Tin. Okay, so from my perspective, and I think to have this conversation in a deep technical way, we would need my CTO on the conversation, but I will try and explain it from my perspective as best I can. So we have projects that have a few different things. One is we do have some projects where we do use proprietary LLMs where we're bringing it into a system that we then host. So, Tin mentioned this earlier. These are, and there actually are open LLMs as well, right? But what Tin mentioned before is that they're trained on data that we don't know. So we're bringing them in because then they're already trained on like the language, they're trained on, all these things. So they're kind of operating the way we want, but we can then bring them into a system where we're hosting the data. We do that a little bit. What we're mostly doing, and which our focus is on, is building machine learning tools within Uwazi, which can do some of that stuff that I mentioned is the benefits, right? So the other thing I think when we say AI, we need to remember that we're not just talking about like the super agents that can like get into your computer and do everything for you, but it's asking the tools to do the processing work. So, we've built machine learning tools in Uwazi that do the automatic translation of certain fields, of text segmentation, right? So a good example is, I think we all know, having worked in this space for a long time, that we deal with a lot of PDFs. And I think we all can agree that PDFs are really annoying because, you got to go into them. You have to like search them. They're not, there's this issue I always talk about, which is like, even if you have access to documents, those documents are not accessible because of the pure volume and because PDFs just are not that accessible. So we've built things, for example, that will automatically scan PDFs and be like, this is the title, this is a paragraph, this is a recommendation. And then you can use text segmentation within there to be like, okay, this is a paragraph about XYZ. So just to give you like an example of how this works, one of our dear partners is called UPR Info, so the Universal Periodic Review. And after a Universal Periodic Review session, they get all of the documents that were generated by governments, by civil society, by rapporteurs. And what they used to do is have to go through each document and like categorize it so it would go into their database. With our machine learning tools, what used to take them 3-4 months now just takes like 2-3 weeks, because they're able to go through, categorize, and then humans in the loop need to go and be like, yeah, that's accurate. But so we've been developing those ML tools. What I find really interesting is like, say I explain that to like my mom, right? And I'm like, hey, she's like, well, aren't there tools that like do that so much like better? Like, are there huge, interpretation tools? I'm like, yes, they are. But you don't know where your data goes. You don't know what's happening with this. It's a huge tool. So we still have space to develop things that are maybe not like frontier, but we're developing them in an ecosystem that is built for social justice, that is built for human rights, and can protect data much more than using those proprietary tools. And then I would also just say, I think, we talk about frontier technologies a lot as the tools that big tech are developing. But there's a really interesting conversation and movement coming about right now around semi-sovereign infrastructure for civil society, around us building, our own systems wherein we could bring in, ML tools so that we could have like note taker apps that aren't feeding all of our info to big tech companies, but that could be like an infrastructure for civil society. This really goes full circle to the first question that I responded to around like the ethical questions that I said creativity. And this is what I mean, right? The systems that we have now don't have to work the way they do. And if we want to create tech systems that are competitive but safe, we have to create them and explore.
Thank you.
That's what I was. Mm-hmm.
Tin, did you want to follow that up?
Yes, plus 100% to everything that Dana says, especially on the sovereign infrastructure. I think that is a huge space for us to explore and to develop. And I think for those of us who are in the European Union or are attached to the European Union, there's a big movement now happening to kind of de-USify infrastructure that is very useful because, the European Union tends to also do things that are not just EU focused, but kind of become a little bit of a standard, the tail that wags the dog globally. So that is great. I want to show an example of the usage of enterprise AI for specific purposes. This is a project that DraftLab has been working on together with Global Partners Digital, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and Dot Studio, and it's called techharmscheck.org. I'm linking in the chat. It's still it's closed. It's about to launch in a month or so. The idea behind it is an impact assessment of risks of technology for human rights projects. So what are the risks of using certain technologies in a project around, development projects around human rights? The idea is that doing impact assessments is hard. It's very complex. And then the idea was, okay, is there a way to help people screen their project ideas in a way that lets them know what they should be investigating further? And so what the Tech Harms Check does is it's a combination of a human-made framework, basically a big kind of database of different technologies, risks, how they relate to different human rights, levels of risk based on context, and so on. And then for people who are not familiar, it uses an MCP server approach, which means this database can plug into, let's say, Claude or ChatGPT, and then Claude can talk to that database directly and ask it questions the way that database wants to have questions asked. And basically what this system does is if I open a Claude and say, hey, I have this project proposal or project idea, can you ask Tech Harms Check to analyze it, to screen it for harms? Within 5 minutes, it receives back a PDF output that we use the system to abstract concept, context, technologies from this project design, and then analyze it against the framework to provide a document that a program officer can use to then decide how to move forward, whether to use the actual in-depth DPIA, to talk to other partners, and so on. And it's working like surprisingly well, to the point that all of the partners on the project are can't wait for it to launch. It basically took there were these like checks and forms before, and we took the process of kind of doing the screening from like a 45-minute very complex form to a prompt in a chat app. And for me, it's an interesting example of, this is a very clear case where there is no actual meaningful, how to say this, risk to anybody directly. It is theoretical projects, right? But it is also designed to plug into enterprise chat systems and AI systems where if, let's say, an organization wants to analyze their own internal confidential details, they can fundamentally trust the legal, at least the contractual agreements they have with enterprise AI companies for their data to be protected from training models. Now, that's a contractual cover. Whether it's good enough or no, that's the question for the risk assessment department. But I think this is an example of the goal there was to understand: can we make this easier? Can we make it easier and make it quicker for program designers to understand what risks they would be running with their project? before, of course, getting into, project implementation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tin. Peja, did you want to come in at all on internal AI capabilities and developing that within civil society?
Sure. I can just add that, inside of our team, in Teget, we have been also discussing that internally, in order to see is it feasible or not, how much. So because, TJ is specific topic. So of course, if you use generative AI, you will always find a lot legal, medical advices, because this is something that people are most oftenly, using AI as a chatbot, to find some answers. But when you come to TJ, of course, it's specific, and okay, you can find some basic. But my point is that if we take example one organization and it has, covering a certain pattern of violation in a certain time frame in a certain location, so I think that it's possible to train AI to use it internally, which means the data is not leaving your organization, not leaving your premises. And I think that, soon, hopefully, it would be possible to move forward into this way. So yes, this is what I had to add about internal management.
Thanks, Peja. So I haven't seen any other questions come through the chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause talking. If there's anyone that would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. Osman, please.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much.
أنا سعيد جدا بحضور
I am very
المحاضرة
pleased
القيمة
that I have been
والمعلومات
able to
الجميلة جدا.
attend this useful
السؤال
webinar, which is full of information. My
الواقع في
question is,
السودان هناك
the
كثير من
reality in
الانتهاكات
Sudan, with all the
وكثير من
violations of human
المنظمات
rights,
شغالة على أساس
and
إنه
many organizations
توثق
are working
للعدالة
on
الانتقالية.
documenting for the human
عندنا
rights
كثير من
violations
الناس
and transitional justice. We have many people in
ما عندهم
Sudan
علاقة بالتكنولوجيا على
that
الإطلاق
they have
ولا بيفهموا
no
في التكنولوجيا ولا بيفهموا
knowledge
في
about
الذكاء
technology,
الاصطناعي.
nor
إضافة
understanding
لذلك
AI.
انقطاع الإنترنت
In
والكهرباء
addition to the fact
ودي
that we
بتهدد
have a lack of
الضحايا
constant
بتحجب المجتمعات المحلية من إنهم
electricity and
يتواصلوا عبر
internet
التكنولوجيا.
in different areas of
كيف
Sudan.
نقدر نتعامل مع
How
مجتمع
can
زي
we
ده؟
deal with
إنه
such
نستخدم
community?
التكنولوجيا مع إنهم
How
هم
can we
أنفسهم
use
ما
technology
بيفهموا
while themselves they are
عفوا ما
unaware
بيفهموا في
of
التكنولوجيا
what technology
وهم
is,
أنفسهم ما
and
بيقدروا يوصلوا
themselves
للتكنولوجيا دي.
they
كيف
cannot
نقدر ناخذ
access
منهم
technology?
موافقة
How
على
can
أساس
we
إنه
get
نستخدم
their
الذكاء
informed
الاصطناعي
consent?
في تحليل البيانات
And
والتعامل مع
how can we
البيانات. شكرا
use
جزيلا.
specific templates to get information from them while they do not use technology, neither we use it? Thank you.
Thank you, Osman. This is a really important question because I think even those of us on this panel are still trying to understand what AI is and how it's working, and particularly in Sudan where there are so many power outages and data is extremely expensive. Explaining it to people on the ground is really critical. So I want to ask, I'm not sure if any panelist feels super strongly that they want to take on this question, but so it goes back to what we were talking about on how we're communicating what this technology is and how it will be used.
I mean, I can try. I mean, I don't. So this is coming from a history of human rights research, as you have also stated, like it can be really difficult. And this is not just about AI. Again, I mean, I think there's been issues around explaining when it comes to informed consent, explaining, once some, even how the internet, it works that sometimes, like, if this picture goes public now, it will be there forever, right? And this isn't even just about informed consent when it comes to our research. This is also about like our lives and our communities and children, and like explaining these things can be so difficult. For me, in the histories that I have or experiences that I have, it's about really truly understanding the project that I'm working on, who I'm speaking with, and doing, your best to explain it and ask probing questions. But if it's a situation where you're absolutely not going to be able to, because the information is so sensitive, then change the workflow. This again goes to like, use the tools that are useful for you, not the ones that are there. And so if it's not right, it's not right. It can be an incredibly useful tool, but what's more useful tool sometimes? Like just good old fashioned human rights research, where you sit with people and you talk with them and you learn and you go through that process of partnership, I guess is what I would say. There's another piece in there though that I wanted to mention, which is around accessibility. So whether it's power outages, whether it's government censorship, I think there's a lot we can do to increase accessibility of our tools in those cases. So for example, we partner with an organization called Horizontal, and they create an app called Tella. And Tella allows people to put their information into our UWASI databases from their phones, right? And what's great about that is if they're inputting something and then they lose connection for whatever reason, that information is not lost. When their connection comes back in, it will upload it to the UWASI instance. And I do think that, this actually kind of goes back to some of those design questions we were talking about earlier. We need to really think through what are the actual use cases that people are like using these tools, and how do we design for them?
Yeah, and I think, Donna, you bring up a really good point on, you had said that when you upload a photo, it's, into the void. And I think challenge and concern is that in the way we practice informed consent is that consent is revocable, in that if someone no longer wants their story or testimony, what is the process and safeguard of honoring that informed consent of, if your situation has changed and you no longer want this to be part of the system?
I mean, so again, this is just speaking to my experiences, and I'd be so curious to hear others on the call and their experience of this. But the reality is if you're putting something out, say for like an advocacy campaign or something like that, unless you've got the power, again, data is political, to go to Google and ask them to get rid of something that you've taken offline and like completely scrub it, which not many of us do. The reality is you can't revoke consent once it's out there, right? And so then that's just about being transparent about that. And that's the informed part. The informed part of this project is potentially that you can't revoke your consent. You can revoke its continued active use in organizations, communications tools or campaigns or whatever, but you can't revoke its previous use. And you just need to be perfectly honest about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I can add to this, I think this for me speaks to like one point. Also, the kind of what we spoke about earlier about like capacity, internal capacity of, these types of questions around, for example, revocability of data and data persistence on the internet are things that are complicated to grasp even for technologists who work with that 24/7. And ideally, we wouldn't have that grasp of that understanding, and also the ability to translate that to people in different cultures, in different contexts, in different environments. It's a very high bar, but it is a bar to try to keep achieving in a way. There's like this understanding that, oh yeah, there is a big chunk of using technology that requires us to become well-heeled technologists, at least up to a point, to know at least ambiently what a thing does or doesn't do and how we need to be able to treat it, especially when it comes to consent, to dignity, and to the rights of the communities we work with.
Absolutely. Would anyone else in the room like to ask a question to our panelists? If not, I think one of the final pieces I want to leave the people in the room with is What are your, I think this conversation has done a really good job of like kind of breaking through the hysteria of and concern around AI. And I'd love if you all could have any recommendations on resources for people to learn more, organizations that you see doing this work well, books, podcasts, resources for people to maybe continue to dive into this topic a bit more.
I can start with because while we were preparing the policy paper, one of the main resources I came upon, and it's a recent one actually, is from Impunity Watch. There are actually one main report, and then following on that report. So the name of the report is the Artificial Intelligence and Transitional Justice Framing the Connections. I can drop the link in the chat, and then actually mapping the current use cases of AI and that data-driven technologies in transitional justice from November 25, which is very useful because it maps, it's built upon I think around 40 case studies around the world. Yeah, thanks, Tim. And it contains links to many of the other examples, resources, successful projects created, successful use of imagery, computer vision, and other ML tools. So yeah, please take a look at this report, because organizations could find also some links to maybe open open source investigation tools that they can use, and maybe find organizations that are collaborating with other organization in creating those kinds of contents and doing those kinds of research. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Peja. Donna, any resources that you recommend for people to check out?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to take this opportunity to do a shameless plug of our website. I would please encourage.
Well, Dana, you didn't have to. I would have.
Thank you. We'll take all the shameless plugs we can get. No, but honestly, so one of the things that we have been trying to do is sort of learn out loud, right? So as we're going through this, as we're learning about the tools that we're implementing, the tools that people are asking for, what it's like developing them, the road that we're on. So do keep up with our blog, and we try to keep it regularly updated with our learnings. And then I would also just say, like, aside from specific resources, it's these kind of webinars are difficult because we don't really know who's on the call, right? And who's listening. But I think the biggest thing is I find that there's a general tech apathy sometimes, where people are like, oh my God, tech, it's so complicated, it's so big, it's untouchable, right? And then people get afraid to ask questions and get in there. And I think that's my biggest thing. It's like, it almost doesn't matter what you're reading, but like attack it with questions and ask people, and nobody really knows, right? That's the thing. So I think my big thing is, it doesn't matter what you're reading. My thing is, ask the questions, be curious, don't be afraid, because nobody really understands. And the more we become comfortable interrogating these things openly and publicly, the more justice we're going to do to our own work, and hopefully develop systems that are more in tune with our values.
Thank you, Donna. And last but not least, Tin, any resources and recommendations you have for anyone on this call?
Yes, a couple. I'll be fast. I think an oldie but a goodie is the Toronto Declaration, made by Amnesty and Access Now, about equality and non-discrimination machine learning systems. We also have, I think, generally a very good resource is the Berkeley Protocol on open source investigations. It's just everything. It doesn't involve AI directly, but it is a very, very good overall primer on how to deal with using technology and entering the technology world into the process. And last but not least, we have a shameless plug for draftlab.org. Come see what we're doing, and we are happy to talk more. Book us for a chat. I always love finding time to help people kind of unpack and understand their very complex things around technology. And thank you so much for this. This was a wonderful chat.
Yeah, and one final shameless plug for the policy paper that will be published in the coming weeks and dives a bit deeper into this conversation. So we are at the end of our webinar, and as we wrap up, we'd be very grateful to those of you on this call if you could participate in a very brief and anonymous survey, which you'll see on your screens in a moment. But I think we'll also be emailing it to all of you. We also have more webinars in this series coming up, and you can visit our events page on sitesofconscience.org to not only see what webinars we have upcoming, but where this recording of the webinar will live for any future reference and sharing. And I want to take a moment to genuinely thank our panelists for this really interesting and rich discussion. I think we could have our own series on AI and human rights. But thank you all for your insights in this. I want to also take a moment to thank our wonderful interpreters, without whom we could not have our interpretation in Arabic, Spanish, and French. So thank you to all of you. And finally, thank you all for attending and sharing your questions and perspectives with us. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. Have a wonderful day.